Pathological varieties of altruism. Who is more likely to cheat? Those who play individual sports or those who play team sports? Looking at a fascinating set of experiments done by Professor Sharon K. Stoll, they were reported in the Chronicle of Higher Education. The experiments compared athletes playing individual sports like golf or singles tennis with those playing team sports like basketball or doubles tennis. And what's striking is that those in the individual sports were exhibiting higher levels of morality, while those in team sports were much more likely to cheat and rationalize their cheating. So one example was from playing tennis. If we think it through, if an example, suppose my opponent's shot lands on the line. Now, according to the rules, landing on the line counts as in. So I'm supposed to call it in, and I lose the point. My opponent got the shot in, so they get the point. So if I'm playing a singles match, though, I lose the point for myself alone. But in a doubles match, both I and my teammate suffer the loss. So the cost of my calling the shot in is doubled. So my incentives are different, and my felt obligation to do what's best for my teammate seems to give me an additional reason to cheat. Also in team sports, here think about American football or basketball. In those cases, the strategy and many of the individual plays are called by the coaches on the sidelines. But by contrast, in individual sports, each athlete himself or herself has full decision-making responsibility. And how does this change your thinking about your obligations if you are the one in charge of calling the strategy and determining the tactics, or if you are following someone else's lead? Individual sport athletes seem much more likely to learn to take responsibility for their actions, while the team sport athletes are much more likely to learn to follow orders and then to shift responsibility to others. I was only following orders. There's also, in this contrast between individual sports and team sports, the matter of how one sees oneself and one's opponents. In an individual sport, you're much more likely to be an example of your opponent as an individual. So I think here of an example of wrestling, because it's a very strong example. In a wrestling match, there's just you and the other guy, and you're grabbing each other and trying to put each other on the mat. One is very aware of oneself and as one's opponents, right, as unique persons. But in team sports, with many people, there's an undifferentiation that starts to occur. And it's even more so if everybody is wearing a uniform. In such cases, you are much more likely to see one's opponents as undifferentiated, depersonalized others. And all of these examples about the individual sports contrasted to team sports, the different incentives, the different responsibility for enacting this strategy, seeing oneself as an individual or as a more undifferentiated part of a group. All of this takes us into darker moral territory in the debates over altruism. And for that purpose, I've borrowed my episode's title here from Professor Barbara Oakley's groundbreaking book, Pathological Altruism, published by Oxford University Press 2012. And Dr. Oakley is both the editor of this volume and a contributor to it. Now, the word altruism and the concept that it's trying to capture is like many, very contentious and philosophically complicated concepts. It's used in a variety of ways, from casual uses in popular culture to more technical use. Now, in its strongest form, it means what the word's coiner, Auguste Comte, a 19th century intellectual and sociologist, meant. And what he meant by it was this is altruism. ism. And so anytime you have an ism, you're elevating what you're talking about to the level of an explicit, conscious principle, identifying what's most essential, what's most differentiating, what's most fundamental. And in this case, altruism is going back to the Latin alter, altruism, saying the other is what we are talking about. So when we are talking about the morality of altruism, as Kant defined it, he meant that the interests of others are ethically prior, and that one's willingness to sacrifice one's own interests for the sake of others, that's the criterion of morality. So notice the 2 points. There's the self and there's the other. There's the ego and the alter, right, so to speak. Well, what comes first? And if you're more egoist, you're going to say, well, each individual has their own life, their own goals, their own dreams. And of course, other people, it's the same thing. But for me, my life is most important. Your life is most important. Altruism, in this sense, is saying, no, that's wrong. And this is Comte's point. You should be seeing the other's needs, the other's interests as ethically higher and more important than one's own. And then the second issue is the action component. One should be willing to give up, to bear the cost without expectation of return, to take a sacrifice of one's own interests for the sake of others. That's what makes one a moral person. If you are, of course, sacrificing others to yourself, or even if you're going into it saying, I'm going to gain and the other person is going to gain, that's not yet moral. It's the sacrifice of interest that is the criterion of morality. So there's a quotation from Comte, quote, "The chief problem of human life," I'm just going to pause there. Notice this is the chief problem. Picking up the quotation again is, quote, "the subordination of egoism to altruism," unquote. Now, this idea of selfless sacrifice for the sake of others in this philosophical form, it has many different philosophical variants. Sometimes those variations are driven by metaphysical considerations. Is it the case that you believe there's a higher world, a supernatural world of the gods, and the gods require sacrifice, that you are supposed to put their interests first? Or are you metaphysically a naturalist, and in more secular form, you think that the others to whom one is supposed to be making prior and sacrificing are people or beings here on in the natural world? Now, in religious form, there's a long history of altruisms. One striking quote I have here from reading a biography of Auguste Rodin, the great sculptor, and one of his teachers, Father Aymard. He went to a strong religious school, and Aymard was actually canonized, became a saint in 1962. But the principle, as reported of Father Aymard, that he was trying to instill in his students was this, quote, "To save society, we must revive the spirit of sacrifice by means of suffering and self-abnegation." So suffering, not enjoyment; self-abnegation, not self-realization or self-development. You are here to suffer, to abnegate yourself, to sacrifice yourself. That's what the essence of morality is, for the sake of society. And he goes on further in another strong remark, "You are here solely to immolate yourselves, body and soul." Your entire being. Immolate your body, immolate your soul. And this is your sole purpose for being here on earth. All right, now that's a strong religious form, and it has a long history as well. There's lots of secular versions of this form of altruism as well. There's one example from 20th century example from Nobel Peace Prize winner Jane Addams, who's kind of a progressive socialist intellectual activist of the early 20th century. In one of her writings, she wrote, "In this effort toward a higher morality in our social relations," so it is this higher morality, "we must demand that the individual shall be willing to lose the sense of personal achievement." I'll pause the quote there. It's not about personal achievement, but personal development, personal growth. You have to lose that and lose even the sense of that picking up the quotation again, and shall be content to realize his activity only in connection with the activity of the many, unquote. So you act as a collective agent or as part of a collectivity, and you only, as the quotation says, act that particular way. So no individuality, no egoism, all collectivism, all altruism in this strong form. Now, there are, of course, people who use the word altruism more casually and to mean something weaker than this, and sometimes it's meant just to mean intentional behavior that respects or benefits the interests of other people. And when people are using the word that way, they don't necessarily imply that there's an opposition to egoism. They will recognize that people in business, when they're trading with each other, or people who are acquaintances, friends, lovers, they're forming social relationships, and part of those social relationships is being mutually respectful of and beneficial to the other person. And of course, you're going to expect that they're going to be respectful of you. So there's a mutual benefit and a mutual respect here. And sometimes people use the label altruism for that. But clearly we have two very different things going on here. One that's talking about selfless sacrifice to the point of immolation and a total collectivism for the sake of others. And this other is just, that there's going to be mutual respect, and you have self-regard, but you also recognize that there are other selves and you regard them as well. So I think the best way to avoid this terminological confusion is to use the term pro-social for intentions and actions that are about fostering positive social outcomes. And then what we're going to have is to say, if we think the pro-social is what we can and should be striving for when we are doing social relationships, how are we going to get to the pro-social? And what we have then is a sub-debate between egoists and altruists about how properly to achieve the pro-social. So the debate then is going to be, one side is arguing, well, we're trying to promote pro-social behavior, trade, peaceful interactions, friendship, romantic relationships, and so on. And that's part of ethics, because part of life is about our relationships with other people. But we're going to argue that pro-social behavior is best enabled by respecting each individual's interests. And that's going to be one side of the debate. The other side is going to argue, well, to get these pro-social behaviors, we have to ask individuals sometimes or frequently to sacrifice their own interests for the sake of the other. So that's then to say, one side is going to say this pro-social requirement of ethics requires that we commit to a win-win kind of egoistic framework. And the other side is going to argue that sometimes or more frequently we have to commit to a lose-win a set of relationships, and that's going to be the altruist position. Now, this matters because the pathological implications of altruism, if we take in the philosophical clear form that we mean literally selfless sacrifice for the sake of others as the criterion of morality, that does connect to the more pathological mindset of some kinds of cheaters. So if we go back, for example, to the examples between team sports and individual sports, why was the tennis player who saw that the shot landed in willing to cheat and say, oh, no, that was out? And it seems to be for the sake of my team. I will sacrifice my integrity in order to lie. Part of your individual integrity is, I get what I earn. I'm an honest person. I don't want to, get points through lying, through deceit. I want to, get points only by earning them. So, in order to lie, I have to sacrifice my integrity. But in this case here, my personal integrity is sacrificed so that the team is improved. And so it's a selfless sacrifice for the good of another. If we think about team work and following orders when you are part of a team, in many cases that seems to, in order to be a part of the team, to be willing to sacrifice your independence of judgment and follow others. You become selfless in that sense. You have less self-agency. You are following the direction of others, and that's a diminishment of the self for the sake of others. If we think of the common expression, there is no I in team. Now, if we push that, then is to say there should be no individuality in the team. You have to take yourself out of the equation if you're going to be part of the team. And then the correlate of that is that when I look at the others, our opponents, I don't see them as a bunch of individuals. Rather, I see them as impersonal or depersonalized members of some collective or members of some group. So I'm not an individual, they are not individuals. Instead, we just have these collectives in collision with each other. And the point of this is that this seems to set up for, and if it's pushed, rationalize some fairly dark behavior. And it seems that those who are behaving badly often seem to be acting as strong altruism requires. They are putting others before themselves. They are valuing the group's needs over their own. They are sacrificing individuality for the sake of the social.
In his book, Entrepreneurial Living, 15 stories of innovation, risk and achievement, and one story of abject failure, Professor Stephen Hicks has put together a series of interviews with entrepreneurs from 6 different countries and 7 US states to explore the adventure and the hard-headedness of business. In this book, Hicks explores what makes for entrepreneurial success and failure. To what extent does success depend on the key decisions, ideas, persistent action, or character traits? How does one's business life fit into one's overall life? And how does one even define success? Our belief is that we can always learn from the accomplishments and setbacks of others. The life stories from others can be informative, cautionary, and inspirational as we each strive to more fully realize our own potentials and achieve our own goals. The 16 entrepreneurs featured in this book are widespread geographically as well as in the range of their endeavors, from sports to education, to fashion to technology, to finance to advertising, to architecture to cosmetics, and more. Observation of success and failure is often the best way to avoid pitfalls, learning from the mistakes of others to get on the pathway to success. This book doesn't disappoint, providing engaging and useful insights from the accounts of 16 entrepreneurs whose reflections are both personal to them and timeless in their significance for the rest of us. Pick up your copy of Entrepreneurial Living, 15 stories of innovation, risk and achievement, and one story of abject failure by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com.
Now, we've got some other very interesting psychologist experiments, social psychologists from studies of some in-group cheating. And this was at Carnegie Mellon University, a university in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so the experiment was run with a group of students at Carnegie Mellon. And in this one group, this first experiment, the students were asked to solve a series of math problems. And once they solved the math problems, they would be paid some money for doing so. So they are in this classroom, and they're all given these math problems, and they're all working away. And then pretty early on into the test, a member of the group, one of the apparent students, but he actually wasn't a pure student, he was a Confederate working with the experimenters, and this was planned. So after a very short period of time, this one member of the group stood up and said, "Hey, I've solved all of the problems." He walked up to the front, turned in his worksheet, and he was given the money. Now, it was pretty clear that it was unlikely that he actually had solved the math problems because there was a lot of them, and some of them were quite difficult. But the supervisor of the experiment paid him his money and didn't check to see whether he had in fact completed the problems and gotten the answers right. Now, there's no surprise that what then happens very quickly among the rest of the students doing the math problems is that a number of them very quickly followed suit. They stood up and said they've solved a whole lot more of the math problems than they actually had. Now, in this case, then, what seems to be happening is, I'm starting off with individual agency. I'm going to solve these problems, and I'm going to get rewarded to the extent that I actually solve these problems. But here's one of a member of my group, another student at Carnegie Mellon University, and he cheated. And he got away with it. And so that seems to then, in many students' minds, well, it's okay then if I do it. So seeing themselves as a member of this group lessens their individual moral agency. Now, there was a variant experiment that was run on this, also fascinating. It was run with a different set of students, and there was one difference. The student who was working with the experimenters wore a sweatshirt from the University of Pittsburgh. And the University of Pittsburgh is a different university across town, and they're kind of the crosstown rivals of students at Carnegie Mellon University. So they're all in there working on the math problems, and the Confederate student wearing the University of Pittsburgh sweatshirt stands up and says, hey, I've got all the problems done, and turns in his worksheet and gets paid, and he's not checked. But when the University of Pittsburgh sweatshirt wearing student made the cheating claim, the subsequent number of cheating by the rest of the students was much, much less. And it seems like there's a morally negative implication here. It seems that to the extent that individuals are thinking of themselves primarily as members of a group, their individual moral responsibility diminishes. So it seems to be that their thinking is, I will cheat if other members of my group do, but I won't cheat if members of other groups do. And that seems to be then to indicate that their moral compass is directed by others in their group, but not by themselves as individual moral agents. All right, now those are some fascinating experiments, but it gets worse, because this in-group identity and out-group identity does and seems to lead to a willingness to sacrifice individuals who are members of the out groups. So as an article from Professor Joachim Kruger, who's one of the contributors to Professor Oakley's volume, and he noted that, and these are his words, quote, altruism tends to be parochial, unquote. And what that means is that when the interests of those in other groups are in conflict with the in-group, whatever group you identify with, the sacrifice of individuals in those other groups seems morally warranted and sometimes even imperative. And in extreme form, this willingness to sacrifice members of the out-group is a component of genocidal psychology. And we all, when we read history, or sometimes we read the more recent news, we're bewildered how it's possible that members of one group can do such nasty, torturing, terrible killing to the point of genocide with respect to other groups. And it seems to be that their thinking is, well, if it's for the good of my group and my group's needs are paramount, anything goes. In many cases, I, as an individual dealing with another individual in some other group, I would never dream of doing various things to that individual. But to the extent that I see myself first and foremost as a member of a group, then my moral compass changes and my individual agency diminishes. And to the extent that I start seeing others in other groups as depersonal, less uniquely individual human beings, I'm more willing to do bad things to them to the extent that their interests conflict with my group's interests. Now, that's with respect to outgroups, but it also seems to occur, these darker forms of altruism, when members of the in-group, some of them seem to be threats to the group as a whole. So if we think of people who are dissenters on intellectual matters, or heretics on religious ideological matters, or even those who have physical deformities or psychological infirmities, there's this easy altruistic rationale that says, well, they can be sacrificed morally. What's good for the others being the group as a whole. These individuals are supposed individuals to sacrifice for what's good for the group. And I, of course, would be willing to do it myself to some extent. And so sacrificing those individuals for the sake of society seems to be moral, according to this pathological version of altruism. And many commentators have noticed the altruistic collectivism built into some forms of eugenics, even American Supreme Court decisions. So if we look at Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, for example, early part of the 20th century, calling for forced sterilization to prevent, quote, the manifestly unfit from continuing their kind, unquote. And this is directly out of Buck v. Bell, 1926. And notice the language here, quote, it is better for all the world, unquote, that such individuals be sacrificed. So it's not individual as the unit of morality, as the unit of agency, as the unit of value. It is better for the world, and the world is a collective other that we as individuals are to be subordinated to. And then, of course, the willingness to sacrifice oneself as an individual for the group, that's a key component of altruism. And in pathological form, if we think about those who seek martyrdom for whatever their cause is, kamikaze pilots, religious suicide bombers. These are examples of those with an extreme willingness to sacrifice themselves so as to display their altruism and to benefit the group's cause. And they're both, they see themselves as setting an example of self-sacrifice, and they see themselves as achieving whatever group benefit that their sacrifice is aimed towards. Now, the point here of all of this is that there's the oft-repeated claim that altruism is a positive, and for many people it's just almost a synonym for being nice, for being benevolent, for getting along and being respectful for people. But there is a hugely complex set of fascinating and disturbing issues that need further explanation on the terminology in the psychology and the moral.
Friedrich Nietzsche was famous for his statement that God is dead, and his provocative account of master and slave moralities, and also for the fact that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis claim that Nietzsche was one of their great inspirations. Were the Nazis right to do so, or did they misappropriate Nietzsche's philosophy? Professor Stephen Hicks' concisely written book, Nietzsche and the Nazis, based on the 2006 documentary, corrects many widespread misconceptions about Nietzsche, giving a fascinating and easy-to-understand analysis of Nietzsche's work, asking and answering a number of questions, such as what were the key elements of Hitler and the National Socialist political philosophy? How did the Nazis come to power in a nation as educated and civilized as Germany? What was Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy? The philosophy of live dangerously, and that which does not kill us makes us stronger? And to what extent did Nietzsche's philosophy provide a foundation for the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis? Professor Hicks demonstrates his mastery of this subject using quotes and critical analysis that prove his points and show the true linkage between Nietzsche and the Nazis, and how philosophical ideas move the world. Get your copy of Nietzsche and the Nazis by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com today. And while you're online, please leave a review for the Open College podcast hosted by Hicks himself on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
Now, just as a start, before I close, I want to take one line of development and say we were talking about altruism as a pretty big tent, but I wanted to do one taxonomical breakdown of altruism along a certain line. So a core thing about altruism is that it sees all of morality as social. Right, so broader conceptions of ethics and morality will say, well, there's you and you have your life, and so there's you in your relationship to yourself, you in relationship to all of reality, and you in relationship to other people. So social morality is an important part of morality, but it's only a part of morality. Altruism comes out of the moral tradition that reduces or sees morality as coextensive with the social. So it's you in relationship to others, your rights, responsibilities, obligations, and so forth in that social context. And And altruism then goes on to say, in your relationships to others, as a matter of principle, you should see others as more important, not yourself. But which others are we talking about? And there are many varieties of our altruism, subvariants, that will differ over which others they take to be morally prior to one's self. And one way of taxonomically organizing this is to take a social hierarchy. Whatever society one is born into has a certain hierarchy. You find yourself in relation to some people who are lower than you, some people who are more or less at your level, and some people who are above you. And then the question is, what are my selfless, sacrificial obligations to these others? But now we've divided those others into their places in the social hierarchy. Now, suppose though we look at those who are lower than I am. They are needy. Maybe they are poorer than I am. They are weaker than I am in some respect. And so I'm in a superior position with respect to them. What does being selflessly sacrificial with respect to those individuals do? And here we find the one prominent version of altruism that makes charity fundamental and central to ethics. So the idea here is that if you are a person in the superior position, you have a obligation to sacrifice for the sake of those lower, to give of your time, to give of your wealth, or whatever it is that one has to make them better off, to satisfy their needs. And it's not because you like these people or that you hope in some way what goes around is going to come around. It's that you feel this obligation to sacrifice some of what you have for the sake of those who have a need. So that would be charity-based obligation. Now, what about those who are more or less at the same level in the hierarchy? Or if we think that people should be more or less at the same level of the hierarchy, but we have people at different places, what should our obligations be? That then is to say, equality or some sort of egalitarian outcome is going to be our goal, and altruism is necessary in order to get us there, because some of us then have to sacrifice having more for those who have less. And of course, then it's fine for some of us to receive the sacrifices if we're starting out from a position of less. Now, here the issue is not that we have needs that are going not unmet. It's rather that we are striving for an egalitarian outcome. We're trying to get people at the same level. And so this is going to be not a charity-based altruism, but an egalitarian-based altruism. And that also has a long history in the altruistic literature. Now, what though if we turn our attention to those who are higher in the social level currently with respect to you? There are those who are judged to be more important than you are. What are your obligations with respect to them? And some forms of altruism rather emphasize knowing your place in this hierarchy and serving sacrificially those who are above you in the hierarchy. And who are those who are above you? Well, there's lots of variations of this. Sometimes it's the family, right? You are born into a family, and we don't see in this approach to the family or this morality of the family as it's about fostering and supporting the individuals to achieve their goals. Rather, the family is the unit of value, and the individuals serve the family. So take an example. This is starting to sound a little old-fashioned from a 21st century perspective, fortunately. But suppose you're a young woman and you want to have it all. You want to have love and education and career, but you want to get your education, start your career, get some money, and then choose whom you're going to marry, and start your family at some point. But the message you hear from your family is, don't be selfish. Don't think of yourself. You have obligations to the family. We will choose the young man that you are going to marry, and we're going to choose someone who's good for the family as a whole, and your obligation is to do what's best for the family. So the young woman in that case is being asked to be selfless. to sacrifice for the sake of others, and in this case, the others are the family. And so that's another classic form of altruism. Now, sometimes it's not the family, but rather it's the nation as a whole. The individual is expected to serve the nation. It's not that the nation is a collection of individuals, and the government of the nation is supposed to serve the people, but rather, in this case, the government is seen as the vehicle for the aspiration of this collective entity, the nation, and it's allowed to use the individuals for the nation's end, and it calls upon those individuals to serve the nation. And sometimes that's tied in with various forms of ethnicity or race, that you as an individual should serve your race, you should serve your ethnicity, you should serve your nation. And of course, there are lots of religious versions of this, that in the hierarchy, you are below the gods, or you are below God, and you exist to serve the gods, and you should sacrifice for the sake of the gods, or sacrifice for the sake of God, and that rather you are a tool or merely a servant to be used by the gods, used by gods, and you should see yourself as a tool or a servant, being willing to sacrifice everything that you are for these higher beings. All right, so far what we've got then is a taxonomy of different kinds of altruism. Some of them are focusing on your obligations to those below you, those obligations with respect to making everyone equal, and those in the social hierarchy, and those focused on you sacrificing and serving those above you. Now, there is then another iteration in altruism that typically comes later, and it comes from more intellectual people who have been saturated in altruistic morality, and then sometimes in theological form, sometimes in philosophical form. They see themselves as wanting to purify this concept of altruism. Now, the classic formula of altruism is selfless sacrifice for the sake of others, but this one wants to purify it and say it's really the selfless sacrifice for its own sake that should be prized. And I call this, in my own thinking, intrinsic altruism. Now, if we take the classic formula, selfless sacrifice for the sake of others, we can ask ourselves, well, what is morally significant fundamentally? Is it your intention, or is it the consequences of your actions? It's the intent behind the action or the consequences of the action. There's a divide in moral philosophy here. Is it that your intention is selflessly to sacrifice, or is it your sacrifice to have practical consequences? And this version of altruism wants to purify morality of practical consequences. It wants to say, it's not about results, it's not about practicality. Instead, we want to focus on the will, on one's motive, on one's intent, what's really driving you inside. So we want to purify morality of consequences and focus just on the intent or the will. It's not that the consequence of others is the important thing. That maybe you like other people, or you care about other people, or that you're going to get some measure of satisfaction from your sacrifice, or in some sense that that other people have benefited. That's secondary, tertiary, or irrelevant to the morality of the action. Pure selflessness is what altruism is about. You take the self out of it. You are doing it as a duty, as an impersonal obligation. Or it's not the selflessness, but the selfless sacrifice the key. The thing is to demonstrate that one has not benefited, or to demonstrate that one has suffered. Now, here we are getting close to pure forms of deontology. We're not quite there yet, but the idea of this form of altruism is to say that the selfless sacrifice for the sake of others, that's right, but it's not the others as recipients. It's them being an opportunity for you to demonstrate that you are engaging in selfless sacrifice for its own sake. All right, so this is a beginning, and just in this ending part, I've outlined what I take to be four varieties of altruism along this dimension. Is it need-based with respect to those lower, egalitarian with respect to everybody at the same level, or serving some higher collective or higher being, or is it selfless sacrifice as an intrinsic duty? And this is a beginning on some very complicated and sometimes very disturbing moral territory.
You are listening to Open College with Dr. Stephen Hicks. Follow Open College on X, Facebook, and on Substack at opencollegepodcast.substack.com. You can also follow Dr. Stephen Hicks on X at SRC Hicks and Open College Pod. Please leave a review in your podcast player and like, share, and subscribe to Open College.